To understand why a wedding ceremony carries this much weight, you have to understand what a royal wedding is actually designed to communicate. For an ordinary couple, a wedding is personal. It's about two people, their families, and their friends. For an heir to a throne, the ceremony becomes a public demonstration of legitimacy, continuity, and stability, broadcast not just to citizens but to foreign governments who are quietly watching to see whether the institution still commands the kind of authority and public support that makes a monarchy worth taking seriously. Every detail, who officiates, who attends, what the bride wears, which cathedral or basilica hosts the event, becomes a signal, whether or not anyone involved intends it that way. Spain has direct, recent precedent for exactly this kind of moment, and it's worth walking through it in detail, because it's almost certainly the template Leonor's eventual wedding will draw from. In May of 2004, Felipe, then Prince of Asturias, married Letizia Ortiz, a television journalist with no royal or aristocratic background whatsoever, at the Almudena Cathedral in Madrid. That wedding was, in many ways, a quiet revolution disguised as tradition. Letizia was divorced, something that would have been unthinkable for a royal bride in earlier generations of European monarchy, and she came from an entirely ordinary, middle-class background. The ceremony itself followed centuries of Catholic and royal ritual, the cathedral setting, the formal procession, the presence of European royalty from across the continent. But the choice of bride signaled something new. That the Spanish monarchy, just decades removed from Franco's dictatorship and still working to prove its democratic legitimacy, was willing to modernize who could join the family, even while preserving the outward form of centuries-old ceremony almost perfectly intact. That combination, old form wrapped around new substance, is exactly the pattern royal weddings tend to follow across Europe, and it's the pattern Leonor's wedding will almost certainly repeat. The ceremony will look traditional. It will likely take place in a historic cathedral, following religious and civil protocols that trace back centuries. Foreign royalty will attend, creating one of the rare moments when Europe's surviving monarchies gather together publicly, reinforcing a kind of quiet solidarity among institutions that have all had to justify their own continued existence to increasingly skeptical modern publics. But underneath that traditional surface, the actual substance, who she marries, what background they come from, how the public and the government react, will say far more about where the Spanish monarchy is heading than the ceremony's formal structure ever will. This is where governance actually enters the picture directly, not just symbolically. Unlike an ordinary wedding, Leonor's marriage requires the formal approval of the king and the Cortes Generales under Article 57 of the Spanish Constitution, and until that approval is granted, no royal wedding can proceed. So before a single invitation goes out, before a cathedral is booked, there is a governmental process happening entirely out of public view. The Cortes doesn't simply rubber stamp a personal decision. It formally exercises constitutional authority over an act that, on its surface, looks like a private family celebration. This means the wedding itself, when it eventually happens, is actually the visible endpoint of a much longer, much more consequential political process, one that determines not just whether a marriage can happen, but whether Leonor and any future children remain in the line of succession at all. The ceremony also functions as a kind of soft power tool on the international stage, something that becomes obvious the moment you look at the guest list of any major European royal wedding. When Felipe and Letizia married in 2004, dignitaries and royals from across the continent attended, alongside representatives from Spain's government. These events are rare opportunities for informal diplomacy, moments when heads of state and foreign royal families interact outside the usual formal channels of state visits and summits. A royal wedding becomes a stage where alliances get quietly reaffirmed, where relationships between countries get a visible, photographed moment of warmth that official diplomatic channels rarely produce. Leonor's eventual wedding will almost certainly serve the same function, turning what looks like a purely ceremonial event into a genuine, if subtle, exercise in international relationship management. There's also the matter of how the ceremony gets used domestically, inside Spain itself, as a tool for shaping public sentiment toward the monarchy. Spain's royal family has spent the past decade rebuilding public trust after the scandals that eventually pushed King Juan Carlos into abdication and exile. A royal wedding offers something rare in that rebuilding project. An almost universally positive news cycle, a moment when even skeptics of the monarchy as an institution can find themselves swept up in the spectacle of a national celebration. Governments and royal households understand this dynamic well, which is why these ceremonies tend to be produced with such enormous care, from the timing relative to other national events, to the careful management of media access, to the symbolic locations chosen for different parts of the ceremony. None of this happens accidentally. It's coordinated with the same seriousness a government might apply to any major public communications strategy, because in a very real sense, that's exactly what it is. Consider, too, how the ceremony will need to address Leonor's specific position as the first woman to become Princess of Asturias under Spain's current line of succession rules. Her wedding will not simply mirror her father's. It will need to navigate genuinely new territory, because Spain's modern constitutional framework has never actually had to manage the wedding of a female heir who is expected to become queen regnant. This is where the 1987 royal decree becomes directly relevant, the one establishing that her future husband will hold the title prince consort rather than king. That decision, made decades before Leonor was even born, will directly shape how her ceremony gets structured and titled, what her husband is formally called during the wedding itself, and how the transition of his role will be explained to a public far more accustomed to weddings where the male partner becomes the more senior royal title holder. The ceremony, in other words, will have to do real communicative work, teaching the Spanish public, in real time, how a modern queen's marriage functions differently from a king's. All of this reveals something important about royal ceremonies generally, something that extends well beyond Spain. A wedding, when it involves an heir to a throne, is never purely sentimental. It functions simultaneously as legal event, diplomatic gathering, and public relations campaign, all wrapped inside a religious or civil ceremony designed to look timeless and untouched by modern political calculation. The candles, the cathedral, the procession, all of it exists within a structure that has been engineered, refined, and repeated across centuries specifically because it works. It reassures a public that continuity is intact. It reassures foreign governments that the institution remains stable enough to engage with seriously. And it reassures the monarchy itself that its own legitimacy has been renewed for another generation. So when Leonor eventually marries, whenever that day arrives, watch closely, because very little of what you'll see will be accidental. The choice of venue will carry historical weight. The guest list will carry diplomatic weight. The title her husband receives will carry constitutional weight, already determined by a decree written decades in advance. And the entire ceremony, however personal and joyful it may genuinely be for Leonor herself, will simultaneously be doing the quiet, essential work of governance, the work of convincing an entire country and a watching continent that Spain's centuries-old monarchy still has a legitimate, stable future ahead of it. That is what makes a royal wedding fundamentally different from any other wedding on earth. It isn't simply a celebration of love. It's one of the most effective tools a monarchy has for governing its own survival.